Hello and welcome. You're now tuned in to CHSF 2106. I hope your day's going well and let's get started. I know this course, there's a little bit of a hiccup at the beginning, but I'm all ready to go and I'm looking forward to starting preparing some content for you and I hope you enjoy it. All right, grab a coffee or whatever and let's get into it. Cheers. I know you guys don't know me yet, but so I live in Kitchener. Um, I've been teaching at Nipsing for a few years now, maybe 3 years, doing this class and a couple others. And this is my crew. So this is, you can see there in the middle, my wife and my daughters Evelyn and Charlotte. And yeah, just I don't know. I have a family of four and live in Kitchener. And I like sports and basketball. Um, and I've been really deeply interested in psychology for my whole adult life. And hopefully I can add some interesting ways at looking at this idea of how the human brain changes over time and how developmental psychology, what it is and how it's relevant for our understanding of all kinds of current issues and struggles that people are dealing with, both at an individual level and a group level. All right, let's get into it. Hey, Charlotte, can you say hello? She's going to be going to sleep real soon. Okay, go back. Sorry, I've been itching to get recording and she's, not 100% cooperating, but I'll get her down pretty soon. It's about 7. Then I might have a bit of time, and then my wife gets back with the 7-year-old. Then I'll get her down, and then I'll have a good chunk of time to record. So the point of this slide, if you're writing this down, right? This idea that we develop, and close your eyes. We develop the same but differently, and that's kind of going to be a theme in this class. And this is kind of an interesting theme that, like, although there's so much similarity in ourselves anatomically, physically, in terms of our, even the actual hardware of our brains, we experience things so differently, we process things so differently, largely because we have such different developmental upbringings, right? So this idea that from conception, the brain's building about a 250,000 new cells. There's either 250,000 new cells per minute. By week, it takes 4 weeks for the brain to start to merge. And we'll talk about what that means, right? That what it means for like the neural tube to start to become the brain. As you can see in these pictures, that this what is originally called the neural tube, and I'll explain this all way later, or way more detail later, but that it eventually is what becomes the part of your, the part of you that's understanding what I'm saying right now. Before birth, genes are mainly directing the brain's development. 1 billion nerve cells created by the time of birth. So right from conception, there's this tremendous emphasis on brain development. And we'll keep going on that on the next slide. I just wanted to introduce you to Charlotte. All right, see you on the next slide. All right, welcome back. Sorry, my plan didn't go uh, quite the way I had thought it would. So this is actually what day is this? This is Wednesday, about 2 o'clock. Not that you necessarily need a time check, but my goal is, as we get into this course, that I'll be giving you everything on Fridays. As you already know, I'm a little bit behind this first week or whatever, which I'm sure people are getting tired of me talking about. So let me just keep to the point. All right, I'll get everything sorted. I promise. I'm gonna work hard at making everything right. So the point I want you to have for your notes is this idea that development is lifelong. That we're not just talking about child development, although this kind of half of the course, this 2106, and then a lot of you will probably be taking 2107 in the winter, and that's going to look more at sort of the later adulthood aspect of development. But this idea that developmentally significant things happen throughout the entire lifespan, right? And you already know that. Obviously being 25 and 85 is very different. That development, when we say how is it different though, how is 25 and 85 different? Well, it's different there's biological and physical differences. There's like cognitive differences in what people are worrying about and how they're making sense of things. There's social differences. You can even have there's emotional differences. This idea that development is plastic, that it's not necessarily set in stone. There's a variety of factors. So people use the word plastic to just mean that humans are actually able to heal from things and get better and stronger, right? So the famous plastics, famous for being able to mold, right? That's why half the stuff in your house is probably made out of plastic. It's adaptable. The idea that your development happens within a world, it happens within a context, right? It happens within an environment, all similar words, right? That your family and your school and your peers and your neighbors all shape your development. So it's this concept of it occurring in a social environment, right? And that development includes all these things. It involves the growth, especially early, right? Especially when we're going to be talking about the development that happens in the womb or the development that happens during infancy, that initial development. But then when we get into older life and we're talking about maintaining things, whether we're talking about cognition or whether we're talking about cardiovascular health, and then at closer to end of life, things like trying to regulate loss, especially if we're talking about things like dementia or Alzheimer's, right? How to regulate, which means try to control that loss that seems to be attributed with age. I'll talk a lot more about that when we get to that point in the course. Okay, so I'm kind of just setting up this idea, what specifically is developmental psychology compared to other branches of psychology, sort of the point of this first presentation. So to add a sort of additional level of this would be good for you to have in your notes. I'll just do all the clicks at once so that it's all there. Then I'll just talk about it for a second. And I think as we get to know each other, you'll kind of learn my style a bit. And what I kind of like to do is kind of give you the points, right? But then hopefully more than just rant. Hopefully I'm trying to present ideas and examples and stuff like that so that it becomes a bit more real, a bit easier to remember that when we're talking about how do you change throughout your life, that's actually a difficult question. How are you different than you were 10 years ago? Well, part of that is biological. You're biologically different than you are, especially if 10 years ago was pre-puberty. Then the changes were highly significant. Cognitively, you're different. And that plays out in a whole bunch of ways. You literally make sense of things differently. Your brain, well, you're irritated by different things. You're attracted to different things. Your whole cognitive system is heavily influenced by your biology and your emotions, right? And then that's the last one, sort of your social and emotional world. And it's interesting because in psychology, they, for whatever reason, love to always combine the words social and emotional. And it's kind of based on this idea that I'm resisting saying your social world and your emotional world are the same, but your emotions, well, at least a certain aspect of your emotions are very out-focusing. And I'll talk about that a bit later in the course when I talk about how babies develop self-focused emotions earlier, right? So a baby can be startled or be excited a lot earlier than it can display something like embarrassment or shame, which demands an understanding of how other people are interpreting you. It's more thought heavy, more conscious heavy. And it comes later in the child's development. Right, but if we wanted to look at an example of some of the social changes, obviously that when the child's first born, it's the parental scenario and the home life, and then school life becomes a much bigger scene, and then high school, and then you're done high school and you're in this what are you gonna make of yourself? Who are you gonna live with? Who are you gonna be with? What are you gonna do? So these and then when you're older, it's and your friends are starting to pass, and maybe even the love of your life passes, and it's who am I anymore in this scenario? It's the challenges that people are facing are I'm going like this, but what I'm trying to say is basically there's levels or stages, and these stages are heavily influenced by age. And that's sort of the underlying idea of developmental psychology, that evolution happens, a species evolves like humans, but each individual human within their lifespan develops, goes from birth to death. So in developmental psychology, we often talk about these like, and people can kind of cut it up or like divide up the life cycle in different ways, but in this class we're going to kind of use these like 7 basic things, right? Like basically, newborn, infant, child, like early child, older child, teenager, whatever. It's like that picture is not like, I tried to do it by that picture and it's not perfect. So just these 7 defined periods, I'm going to go through them right now. Okay, the very first piece of the story, right, is and this is the topic I'm going to cover in the presentation called Biological Beginnings. It's chapter 2 in the textbook. It's actually not next week, or it's like I think week 3, or it's coming up. And I'm going to get into this idea of like the prenatal development because it's a huge part, right? So much of the brain is developed in the womb. It's one of the reasons why humans are as smart as they are. The long pregnancy is directly related to brain development. There's tremendous growth during this period. Prenatal means from the very time of conception, so when the egg plants, the fertilized egg plants, and then into the wall of the uterine, and then it's like all the way to birth, right? Approximately 9 months on average, as you already know that. But we're going to talk in this course about that mainly from the perspective of this growing brain. The second stage we're going to look at in this course is the infancy stage, right? So once the baby's been born, we're looking at the first, like, and some of these, basically the first 1.5 to 2 years, the baby's highly dependent on the parent, on mom, psychological activity, and I'll talk about all the different types of family situations. Psychological activities include in the beginning of the development of language, and especially I'll talk all about how like babies are so interesting because they like obviously understand a lot more than they can. That's called like receptive vocabulary is a lot higher than their expressed vocabulary, so they can understand a lot more than you think. And that's why like you can teach a baby to go like this to mean that they want more food, or they can go like this to mean all done, and they can understand that way before they could say it. But you're seeing them starting to use language, starting to use gestures, and starting to be able to think at a higher level. I say they're symbolic, and I'll explain what that means in the course. Their coordination's getting better, right? And you got to think of what coordination even is. It's actually a super interesting thing from a psychology perspective. It's like literally the connections between the muscular system and the brain are getting better. We call it like eye-hand coordination, or the big thing at this age is trying to get that long connection. By the time they're 2, their hands are decently dexterous. It's that longest connection in the body, head to toe, right? So that's why walking comes last almost, and not necessarily last, but comes later, right? It's a difficult connection to form, right? But most babies are doing it around that too. And I'll talk more about that too when we talk about physical development. So in this third section, you're going to notice here that we sort of talk about it as, and some of the reason for the split is that like so much is happening in terms of brain development in those early years, and early childhood is so significant too because there's almost this like transition from being mainly influenced by the home environment to now starting to be exposed to peers, like going to school and stuff like that. So we're going to look at this, how early childhood and going up to like say 5 or 6, the child's getting more self-sufficient, more able to do their own things. It's like my 2-year-old demanding to like that she wants to put on her pajamas herself. It's like sometimes it'd be quicker for me to just do it, but it's cool because she's like asserting sort of her independence, and you can see this like internal drive almost in her to try to do things herself. As you get later in school too, this like development of like reading, writing, and arithmetic, and being exposed to, so that's like the cognitive pieces, the thinking, the thought processing is getting a lot more advanced, right? And it just seems so normal to us because we're humans, obviously, right? But if you're looking at it from as a not a human, if you're like an alien researcher, you'd be like, it's actually pretty interesting how these humans are born and they have this childhood period, this extended period of exploration that's linked to cognitive development. And if you were looking at it from the outside, you'd see it as completely related to why we reach the cognitive heights we do. It's what you do as a kid has a huge effect on, well, everything. And this is kind of going to be a rant I go on later in the course when I talk about people like Piaget, and that was his big idea that there's actually stages of development. It's not like a kid's just a not as smart adult. It's like that's a way too simplistic and actually incorrect way of looking at it. There's major differences at all levels of processing, and Piaget said it's almost like you have to view it as like levels, like you're leveling up. And so anyways, I'll talk more about that obviously when we get to that point, but I'm just sort of giving the quick overview here. Okay, so you might have noticed some background noise. I had, in my attempt to cover up back noise, I was playing a little bit of like um, just a bit of background music to hopefully like, but then I noticed I just was rewatching it and that it like kind of cuts when I talk. So if that was annoying you, you don't have to worry. I'm not going to do that anymore. Sorry about that. Okay. The fourth stage we're going to look at adolescence. This is a super interesting one, right? Because, and I'll go a lot into how changes that are being largely stimulated by by this transforming hormone system in the body, but how that's related to all these obviously biological changes we associate with puberty, but also major changes in thinking and understanding of self and all those kind of things. We see these rapid changes in terms of physical characteristics like height and weight and body shape or contour and sexual characteristics too. And we also see though, so that's like the physical part. You're also at the point of your life where there's a lot more pressure around like, who are you? And part of that is like, who do you hang out with? Who don't you hang out with? What do you do when you hang out with them? What don't you do? How much consistency is there with you between different settings? Right? Like how stable is your identity? Are you kind of a different person with every group? As teens get older too, there's more. I'm almost sometimes waiting for questions. And it's like, oh no, no, I'm recording this in the basement by myself. More logical thought. You start to see more abstraction, more ability to kind of play with and manipulate complicated ideas. Again, if you're as an alien looking in from the outside, you'd be like, oh, this person's able to actually do things with their brain. Piaget would call those cognitive operations that they couldn't before. There seems to be an emergent quality to brain development, which just literally means it's not like you're doing something better than you used to. It's like you're doing something that you didn't used to do. It's a new thing. It's a new thing that seemed to grow from within it, which is basically what the word emergent means. And also at this time, you're seeing a lot more time outside the family, right? Obviously, like when you were a teenager, and this increase in risk taking. And I'll do a deep dive on that and how that's entirely evolutionary and actually pretty interesting to dive into. So this is pretty interesting too, and I think again I'm kind of giving you the overview of what developmental psych is in this course. We're probably gonna not quite get to these last three, but again I want you to please record this because most of you are in the next course too, and this is sort of just where this obviously keeps going, right? Like if this course goes to the end of the teens, it's like, well, okay, but what happens once you turn 20 and once you turn 30? And this like kind of early adult period where there's a lot of pressure on you to sort of get your life together, right? A lot of things that were cute and excusable in your late teens and early 20s are a lot less cute and excusable in your mid 30s. So there's a lot of pressure to establish personal and economic independence, become proficient, good, skilled in your career, and maybe even start a family. I should have maybe picked different language and just say mate, right? But there's pressure for partner selection or not. But even if your answer is not, there's still pressure related to that. That's characteristic of this stage of life. middle adulthood. So this is by like, unfortunately, I've recently crossed this threshold. Um, right, different things that you're stressed on, different things that worry you. It's like a little less like worried about how you fit in socially, a little more worried about like if what you're doing matters. There's different pressures at different levels, and this is going to be kind of one of my points, is that it's not, this course isn't really comparing you to a 12-year-old and you to a 50-year-old. It's comparing you at 12 to you now to you at 50. It all has to have that personal relevance. It's like it's comparing yourself to yourself. And that when you're older, it's like this idea of like assisting the next generation, whether it's through like teaching or coaching, or whether it's through anything where you feel like you're doing something that is helping the next generation. Like we just know that that's associated with mental health at that age. This is the time of the life too when people tend to have the most expanded sort of social and personal responsibilities. Some of those are financial, some of those are maybe kids, some of those are maybe taking care of older parents. All right, so again, in the future lectures, I'll really be deep diving into each of these stages. This last stage, I don't know, when I've taught this course for a long time because I've taught developmental psych style courses at Nipissing for about 3 years, but I've been teaching, the first course I ever taught was developmental psych at University of Waterloo, and I think that was now like something like, I'm going to age myself, but something like 15 years ago, and I was coming at it a little bit more from a science perspective of like being really interested in like the early brain development, and I still am. That is still really interesting to me, and I was maybe less interested in like late adulthood development, and that's definitely changed. And I think we're going to be able in this class to have some really interesting discussions about what's going to matter in your life later. What are you going to be reflecting on, and how do we prepare you to have a mentally, and I say prepare you, but I mean like how do we prepare ourselves for successful aging, and what does that even mean? Okay, so we'll break that down too. So related to this concept of age, and this is kind of some content from the textbook, but I think it's interesting way of looking at it, that you sometimes hear people talk about age in different ways. The easiest way is like chronological age, right? Like I told you before, I'm 42. None of you probably thought when I said that I meant like in terms of my lung health or in terms of my social status. Like you thought I meant chronological age. How many trips around the sun, right? So it's like there's chronological age, which is just basically how old you are. But then you sometimes hear people say things like this, like somebody has been like heavily smoking for a long time, maybe has the longest of someone 10 years older or whatever. I just made that up. But that idea of talking about it in terms of how somebody relates to. So what that would really mean if someone said something like that is that we've charted what people's lungs are usually like, and we've compared that to age, and what your score is usually associated with someone higher. So it's large scale pattern recognition. And same thing with the other two, right? So the other one's psychological age. Like this is maybe the most difficult one, and I'll spend some time talking about this, but you sometimes hear this in terms of, say, for example, developmental disabilities. And I'll explain again like a lot more about this when we're moving through, like this person's functioning at the level of somebody much younger than them. And again, I'll be sensitive in how I talk about those topics. And then social age, like say this is a good example. If you say like your grandma, maybe she's like super active and she still like goes out all the time with her friends, and it's like she almost lives like she's a teenager. If I was to say that to you, you would know what I meant by that. Or if I said, oh, she kind of lives like she thinks she's a teenager, you wouldn't be like, oh, so you mean she like stays inside all the time? It'd be like, no, it means like she's like partying and getting out and doing things. Right now, some of that's like a stereotype of what I think a teenager is like, but like what I'm basically saying is this idea of like One of them is your age, one of them is sort of related to biological function, one of them is related to cognitive and psychological function, and one of them is related to level of social engagement. Another thing that you'll hear people talking about is, and that's brought up in the textbook, is this idea of patterns of aging. And the word normal always like upsets people, but it's a statistical word. It means if you were to look at 10,000 people, there's going to be major differences between individuals, but there's going to be incredibly noticeable patterns at the group level, which means not everyone's going to fall into everything you would predict, but way more than chance. And that actually there's quite a bit of cross-cultural comparisons tend to continually show that people are more similar than not. Most individuals tend to have their psychological peak in early middle age, right? So like around like the late 30s, early 40s. This tends to stay relatively stable until their late 50s, early 60s, tend to see moderate or modest decline in the 80s, and people tend to have, and I know I've seen this in my grandparents, where it tends to be like even people that stay mentally strong close to the end, there tends to be pretty significant quick decline at the end, and we'll talk about that. But so the idea is that like, and this is backed up by the stats, like especially if you're a female in Canada, you can probably expect to live on average till somewhere in the mid 80s, and if you're a male, it's a bit less than that, the early 80s. Okay, so that's what we just say, kind of normal or average. Pathological seems to maybe be a word that's like falling out of favor a bit. But a pathology is like when like a pathology is like talking more at a disease level, but pathological means when there's like something going wrong, right? Like something like early onset Alzheimer's. When individuals show a more decline than average. And this is often associated with things like cognitive impairment, so things like Alzheimer's. You can even just see in that picture I included of the deterioration and the shrinkage in the hemisphere of the brain with Alzheimer's depicted there on the right. And how sometimes developing, I say they're developing Alzheimer's disease or having some kind of chronic disease, could also be like lung or cardiovascular, can have a major effect on daily functioning, which is sort of obvious, but is majorly significant to how one goes through, especially those last stages of life. So then I'm also going to talk about this idea of like, what would it mean to age successfully? And I think it's, first of all, there's not like one ticket, but again, like a lot of things in life, there's a lot of paths you could take, but the paths are most certainly not all the same. And they're not going to be the same in the amount of struggle. They're not going to be the same in how rewarding they are. They're not going to be the same in the end results. And so, especially when you're younger, you're sitting in this weird time in life where it seems like the possibilities of what you do with your life are endless. That's not going to be like that forever, though. And so the choices you make matter. I don't know why I got onto this rant, but this idea that establishment of successful patterns earlier seems to be, and somewhat obviously is connected to successful aging. That like everyone's going to decline in certain areas when you're older. The stronger you go into that decline process, in general, the better the process. And what I mean by that is like staying at least somewhat physically engaged, staying mentally alert, keeping social relationships to the level that you can. All those things actually, well, they actually literally affect your immune functioning. And I'll talk about that in some of Viktor Frankl's ideas around logotherapy later in the course. But this idea that successful aging is linked with this idea of being heavily engaged in life, oftentimes, sometimes just out of luck, not having developed a very serious illness, and then like being physically and cognitively active. Okay, so one of the topics that we're going to come back to a bunch of times in this course is the idea around nature and nurture. And if you're following along in the PowerPoint, you might notice I dropped a slide. I sort of said a similar thing on that slide. It was just a different kind of image depicting this age-old debate. Like, why do you behave the way that you do? Why do you feel stressed out when you're out on a first date with someone? Is it because of you, or is it because of the environment? Is it because of how you were raised, or is it because of your internal cortisol levels that affect your stress threshold? It's like, is the issue biological? Is the issue environmental? And what I would say to you is, like, at this point in 2023, we understand that basically everything is some kind of complicated mixture. Almost nothing is one or the other. Right? Most things, and I'm sure I could think of examples of things that are one or the other, but most things are a complicated, it's more the question is like, how is nature and nurture interacting in this situation? Right? That at the most basic level, you're a biological organism born into a world. What you are as an organism affects your experience, but also the world that you're born within does. All right, so sometimes when we're talking about issues, I'm going to talk about like, okay, well, how is some of this nature, natural, genetic, inborn, inherited, those are all the same side, and how is this influenced by nurture, environment, social conditions, learning, all that kind of stuff. Parents, religion, school, media, that's all on the nurture side. Okay, so I have one more slide here. I basically cut this presentation, cut it up a bit, and what I'm going to do is try to get this out tonight on Wednesday, and then tonight and tomorrow try to get the rest of it recorded and out, and also and at the very latest by sometime on Friday, I'll also be giving you the first reflection. Okay, so what I would suggest, well, maybe I'll just finish this slide for now, and I'll be in contact in the next couple of days with more stuff. Okay, and I'm going to try to, as I give you stuff, set it up in a way so that you can like understand what I'm asking you and get at it immediately, and hopefully it'll make sense and be clear. One of the last things I want to talk about is this idea of how nature and nurture looks at how some things change and some things don't. Like, if it's all just learning, it seems weird that puberty would happen, that everybody would go through this massive transformation at roughly the same time. If you compare hundreds of thousands of people, it's at roughly the same time. And there's obviously a lot of complications and all kinds of things, but even before we understood genetics, people knew that it almost was like people were almost, and again, I'm trying to avoid using just the words genetically programmed to do that, and why, and how things stay the same sometimes and why they change sometimes, and why and this other terminology of like continuity, or things continuing, or discontinuity, like how certain things change. Like, for example, with a baby, it's like they're able to, when they're little, before they're talking, they're making sounds that are possessing the little pieces of basically all languages, and as they learn one language, they lose that ability. So that's kind of interesting. That's a discontinuity. It's like that's something they actually lose. Then we're also going to talk about how some differences in this course are quantitative and some are qualitative. So sometimes we're talking about, just think of quantitative, the bottom purple word on the left. You can see the word quantity, and that means like how many. If I'm like, what's the quantity of how many bags of chips you got? And you're like, I got 5. It's like, that's a number. Quality, I'm like, what bag of chips tasted best? And you're like, I like this one the best. That's more qualitative. Qualitative means more like type. So it would be like, okay, quantitative change would be something like the average Canadian woman in 1914 was 5'2". In 2014, they're 5'4". The reason for that is a bunch of stuff we could talk about, mainly nutrition. Now, what's interesting is, so that's something you could like give a score to, right? Like that's like the switch from 157.6 centimeters to 163.9 centimeters. But if you say like, okay, well, how someone identifies and sees themselves when they're 5 different than how you do it when you're 22? It's like, that's a way more complicated question. That's more like, what is identity even experienced as at this age versus this age? This is getting more into like a qualitative kind of question. And again, I'll be using these words and hopefully giving examples throughout the course to make it make sense. All right, so thanks for this is the first part of chapter 1, and remember, with this second week, there's no real video. I'm mainly going to present the reflection exercise. So basically, you got this part 1. I'll be coming out with part 2 in the next day or two, and then I'll be coming out with, basically, I'm going to have you do some readings or pick a reading and answer a few questions about it. The first reflection's pretty straightforward, and I hope it won't be too stressful, but I want to get all that perfected before I talk to you too much more about it, and I'm aiming all this stuff at Friday, okay, of this week. And then after that, I'm going to try to hit every Friday with my releases of stuff. All right, everyone, thanks, and catch you in the next video. Cheers.